with Councillor Hill here. So whenever you want to give me the green light.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, perhaps I will just get started. I see Councillor Kiley joining us now, so I'll just do a brief introduction just to let everyone know who's currently in the meeting with us. So welcome everyone to tonight's Planning Committee meeting. I'm going to start by confirming that we do have quorum and we have all members of the committee with us this evening. Staff members who are joining us are Tim Park, Director of Planning Services, Sukriti Agarwal, Manager of Policy Planning, James Barr, Manager Development Approvals, Laura Flaherty, Project Manager, Neil Odie, Senior Planner, Ryan Leary, Senior Planner for Heritage Services. I am myself, Elizabeth Fawcett. I am the committee clerk, and we have Blair Johnson joining us as the meeting host this evening. We also have Brent Totterin of Totterin Urban Works as one of the city's consultants, and we currently have 9 members of the public in the gallery this evening, Mr. Chair. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. This evening, we are doing a review of the second draft of our comprehensive zoning bylaw. For those of you that haven't received it, it's a mere 508 pages long. We will have an opportunity to ask questions, and we'll have a very good staff presentation on this. I will read out the notice of collection, and then we'll begin. Personal information collected as a result of this public meeting and process is collected under the authority of the Planning Act and will be used to assist in making a decision on this matter. All names, addresses, opinions, and comments may be collected and may form part of the minutes, which will be available to the public. Questions regarding this collection should be forwarded to the Director of Planning Services. The purpose of the public meeting is to present planning applications in a public forum and to give the public an opportunity to make representations in respect of the proposal as required by the Planning Act. Following presentations by the applicant, the meeting will be open to the public for comments and questions. Persons speaking at the meeting are requested to give their name and address for recording in the minutes. Additionally, interested members of the public can email the committee clerk or the assigned planner if they wish to be notified regarding a particular application. No decisions are made at public meetings concerning applications. An exception to this rule is combined reports, which consolidate the public meeting and comprehensive reports. These applications are deemed by staff as straightforward and routine, which clearly tonight's isn't, so it'll just be a public meeting. Public meeting reports are provided to inform the public of all relevant information. After the meeting tonight, staff will be considering the comments made by the public in their further review of the applications. When the review is completed, a comprehensive report will be prepared, making a recommendation for action to this committee. That recommendation is typically to approve with conditions or to deny. The committee then makes a recommendation on the applications to City Council, who has the final say on all applications. Following Council decision, notice will be circulated in accordance with the Planning Act. If a person or public body would otherwise have the ability to appeal the decision of the Council of the Corporation of the City of Kingston to the Ontario Land Tribunal, but that person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Kingston before the bylaw is passed, that person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision. So tonight, we're looking at the new citywide bylaw, zoning bylaw, and official plan amendments. And we'll begin now. Our Laura Flaherty, I believe, will be doing the presentation. Given the extreme complexity of this, we'll be looking to give her between 30 and 40 minutes to do her presentation. And then we'll turn to the public for their questions or comments. So the floor is yours, Laura.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So please let me know if my audio cuts out, and I'll try to adjust my internet connection here. So thank you for joining us today for the statutory public meeting on the second draft of the new zoning bylaw project and the associated official plan amendment. So for those of you who haven't been involved in any part of the project so far, my name is Laura Flaherty. I'm the project manager in planning services, and my primary responsibility at the current time is the city's new zoning bylaw project. So Elizabeth has already introduced all of the city staff who are with me to answer any kind of questions that might come up related specifically to their expertise. So next slide, please. Before I get into it, here's a quick overview of the plan presentation for this evening. Obviously, the new zoning bylaw is a really, really large topic that I couldn't possibly cover in one evening, even if I tried. So we want to ensure that the presentation is as helpful as possible, providing the foundation for the work that was done leading up to the second draft with some highlights of the bigger topics. I won't be going into every detail of the requirements in this presentation, but if members of the public or planning committee have specific questions they'd like to be addressed following the presentation, we're happy to answer any topic that's covered by the new zoning bylaw or the official plan amendment. So I'll be providing some background information about the new zoning bylaw project as a whole with the overall timeline that's associated with it. I'll then give a very quick refresher about the discussion paper topics that were presented at public meetings in April and June. And finally, I'll actually get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation, talking about the structure of the zoning bylaw, highlighting some of the changes that are contained in the second draft, and outlining the amendments that are proposed in the official plan. Next slide, please. So let's get right into it with an introduction to the project and some of the background about the first draft. Next slide. So zoning bylaws, what are they? When we're looking at the overall framework in Ontario, zoning bylaws are the most detailed tool to implement the higher level policies and the overall broader vision that's contained in the official plan and the provincial policy statement. So at a high level, the planning acts the legislation that allows municipalities to pass a zoning bylaw and contains specific direction about items that can be regulated in the zoning bylaw and the processes that must be undertaken when passing a zoning bylaw. The provincial policy statement, or what we call the PPS, it's a document that's established by the province, and it sets out direction on matters of provincial interest related to land use planning, and it sets the stage for municipalities to regulate land use and development in Ontario. So when we pass a new zoning bylaw, it's required to be consistent with the PPS. The official plan, or what we also call the OP, it's the city's vehicle to really implement the PPS. So it establishes the broader policies that manage and direct land use changes in the city of Kingston, while also protecting the natural and cultural heritage, managing resources, and planning for necessary infrastructure. So the current OP, it came into force in January of 2010, and the most recent 5-year update came into effect in August of 2017. So when we pass the new zoning bylaw, it's required to conform with the official plan. Zoning bylaws, when we go down the levels here, they're actually the most detailed regulatory tool we have available to actually establish permissions on individual properties. So they can regulate the use of land and buildings, the size, height, and location of buildings, the frontage, depth, and area of new parcels of land. They regulate loading or parking facilities, landscaping or amenity areas. They can prohibit development in hazardous, contaminated, or environmentally sensitive areas. And they can also be used to establish minimum separation distances between uses. So next slide, please. So just as a background information, in Kingston, we currently have 5 main zoning bylaws that apply across the municipality. All 5 of them, they're legacies of the former townships, and they all predate the amalgamation of the city of Kingston. So 3 of the existing zoning bylaws were adopted in the 1970s, and 2 of the existing zoning bylaws were adopted in the 1990s. So as you can imagine, it's rather a patchwork of existing zoning that applies across the city, and they're all inconsistent with each other. And there's different rules that currently apply to different areas. So since they also all predate the official plan by quite a long shot, it means that the existing zoning bylaw provisions that are in effect do not actually reflect the current official plan policies. And there's quite a big disconnect in some areas between the vision for future growth in the city and the provisions of the existing zoning bylaws. Next slide, please. So before we get into the specifics of the second draft of the new zoning bylaw, I think it's important to quickly explain a bit of the project background and how the first draft of the new zoning bylaw was created. So the project has been talked about for over 10 years. I think starting back in 2011 with phase 1 was the actual technical start of the project. So it resulted in a strategic direction for the new zoning bylaw and for an RFP that would guide a future consultant to complete the work. So the strategic direction largely focused on this project as a consolidation of the existing zoning bylaws. So phase 2 was led by an outside consulting team, and it resulted in the creation of the first draft of the new zoning bylaw, which was ultimately released in October of 2016. So when the first draft was created, the consultant first identified major areas that needed to be updated to better align with the current official plan policies. That included the environmental protection area policies, the prime agricultural areas, and some elements related to employment areas. And then the remainder of the first draft was mostly a reflection of the consolidation of the existing zoning bylaws by bringing similar zones from the existing bylaws into one zone in the new zoning bylaw, and by comparing the general provisions to determine the best approach for one consolidated set of general provisions. So the creation of the maps that went along with the first draft, they actually used the existing zoning boundaries as the basis, and then updated boundaries of certain zones to conform with the official plan. So on the screen in front of you is a detailed chart which identifies the approach to consolidating many of the existing zones were included in the first draft. You certainly don't need to look at the details of it. It's merely meant to represent, this is part of the process that the outside consultant who is in charge of phase 2 of the project and the creation of the first draft, when they went through and did this detailed exercise, this is the result of their recommendations. So the process for matching the old zoning categories, it included delineating the urban and rural and hamlet areas that are currently identified by the official plan, grouping together similar zones from the different zoning bylaws, and conducting high-level assessments of the zoning provisions to ensure that they're similar. So looking at the actual standards that apply and also the permitted uses. So the ultimate goal was to create a new zoning bylaw which maintain very similar standards to those in effect in the existing zoning bylaws, with minor amendments to address areas that do not conform with the official plan policies. Next slide, please. So following the release of the first draft, the project was put on hold to dedicate staff, time, and resources to other major policy projects that needed to be completed in advance of us releasing the second draft, such as the official plan update and the Central Kingston growth strategy. So when we talk about a new zoning bylaw for the city of Kingston, we really have a vision to harmonize, simplify, and modernize the zoning framework across the municipality. So to us, in this third and final phase of the project, which is being led by city staff, harmonizing the zoning provisions is more than just a consolidation exercise. So it means the second draft has been amended to carry forward some of the existing zoning bylaw regulations, but it also means that new and updated regulations are included to better align the document with the vision that's established by the official plan. Simplifying the zoning bylaw means that the language in the maps have been modified to be as user-friendly as possible. So obviously a zoning bylaw is a legal document and some legal language can't be avoided completely, but wherever possible, we've amended the requirements to be more easily understood. And then modernizing the zoning bylaw means that terms have been updated, uses better reflect current uses that we actually see today. And they've been written in a way that's intended to allow for innovation and for new uses to thrive in the future. Next slide, please. So the second draft does include some standards that are still reflective of the original project intent to consolidate the existing zoning bylaws. Some of the areas have been tweaked and some other areas have actually been given a rethink to align our vision to harmonize, simplify, and modernize the bylaw in this third and final phase. So some of the items that have been given a rethink include the parking, loading, and bike parking requirements, home occupations, site-specific exceptions, residential uses, and complementary uses in places of worship. Items that have been tweaked include employment lands, schools, additional residential units, tiny houses, and environmental protection areas. And then items that remain as a consolidation include most of the zone standards and boundaries, except where they would conflict with the official plan. Next slide, please. So we recognize that the final version of the new zoning bylaws, it's now urgent from a timing perspective to really align development with the overall vision established by the OP. So the final phase was initiated just over a year ago in September of 2020, and it included consultation through non-statutory public meetings about some of the larger tweak and rethink topics through the discussion papers. So the second draft of the new zoning bylaw was released to the public on August 6th, and we've asked that comments try to be provided by November 5th. We'll continue to accept comments up until the final decision is made on the document, but providing the comments by November 5th allows us time to fully consider and address the comments before making any of the final recommendations. So tonight's the first statutory public meeting on the project. We have a special meeting of council that's scheduled for November 9th, where staff will be providing all members of council with an update on the public comments, as well as seeking direction from council on the preferred approach for addressing the older site-specific exceptions. We'll then work to review all of the technical comments and the public feedback and address any direction that's received by council, leading to the final statutory open house and then a statutory public meeting at another meeting of planning committee where a comprehensive report would be considered or presented for consideration. So ultimately, City Council has the final decision-making authority on the passage of a zoning bylaw and the proposed official plan amendment. Under the Planning Act, there's a 20-day appeal period following Council's decision, and then any appeals on Council's decision would be dealt with by the Ontario Land Tribunal. So at this time, we're aiming for final recommendations in early 2022, but this timeline could be impacted by public feedback or specific directions from City Council. Next slide, please. So recognizing that a lot of time has been spent speaking specifically about the discussion paper topics, I'm just going to provide a quick reminder of the content that was addressed in each paper and highlight the changes that were included in the second draft. Next slide, please. So the two public meetings were held in April and June with two discussion paper topics presented at each meeting. The meetings were held via Zoom and the recorded videos are all still available on the city's YouTube channel for those who missed them. So actually, if you have access to this presentation in the future, you can just click on the images that are on the slide and it'll bring you right to the videos for those YouTube videos. So the April meeting discussed environmental protection areas, the ribbon of life and water body setbacks, schools and places of worship. The June meeting discussed the power of parking, a new parking paradigm for Kingston, and tiny houses, shipping containers, and additional residential units. Next slide, please. So as a quick overview, the intent of the EPA Ribbon of Life and Water Body Setback paper is to amend the official plan to allow the zoning bylaw to better implement the intent of the riparian corridor policies, which means that the second draft has transitioned the protection of riparian corridors from a mapped-based EPA zone into a text-based 30-meter setback. So this change has expanded underlying zoning permissions to approximately 4,200 properties without creating legal nonconformity issues while still maintaining the same protections for riparian corridors. Next slide, please. So between the discussion paper and the second draft, we revised one of the initially recommended approaches where we had just blanket an exemption for one small structure from the 30-meter setback. So we've included a revised provision in the second draft to allow for a small accessory building, which would be less than 10 square meters in area, only on existing residential properties, and the building must be set back a minimum of 7.5 meters from the high water mark. Next slide, please. So the intent of the schools and places of worship discussion paper is to ensure that the second draft of the zoning bylaw and the official plan treat private and public schools the same, revise definitions to focus on the use and not the users, revise the zones where schools are permitted, and updates the zoning maps to provide a more appropriate zone for schools within their neighborhood context, and also to allow for complementary uses within places of worship, which might include commercial, office, community centers, cultural or educational uses, and catering kitchens, and also expanding the permissions for additional residential units where a place of worship is located in a residential zone. Next slide, please. The tiny house shipping container and additional residential unit discussion paper covered a few different topics, obviously. So first, it addressed the new provincial legislation requiring municipalities to allow for up to 3 residential units on properties that currently only allow for 2. Secondly, it amended the new zoning bylaw to clearly recognize and plan for portable tiny houses in the city. And finally, it included a description of shipping containers in the definition of building to ensure that we have really good clarity about how repurposed shipping containers are regulated from a zoning bylaw perspective. Next slide, please. So in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw, the definition of building has been amended to address some of the comments that we received. So specifically, where a portable tiny house has been placed more permanently on the ground by removing the wheels and connecting to permanent services. In the new zoning bylaw, we would consider this to be a permanent building, and it would be subject to the requirements that apply to additional residential units, which means that the portable tiny house wouldn't need a temporary use bylaw to be passed in order for it to be permitted. Next slide, please. So finally, the last discussion paper, but certainly not the least, is the power of parking, a new parking paradigm for Kingston. So it was co-authored by staff and Brent Todderin. So Brent's obviously here with us tonight to help answer any questions or comments that are connected to this work. So the intent of the power of parking is really to start a brand new public conversation about parking's connection to virtually every element of how the city is built, and to provide a call to action to everyone to think about parking in a very different way. So it connected the dots between some of the larger city goals, and it discussed innovative new ideas and options. It really examined the true cost of parking, including the many public costs and consequences of providing too much parking. So presenting important ideas like reducing or eliminating parking minimums, creating parking maximums, using parking incentives to achieve strategic outcomes like enhanced bike parking, car share parking spaces, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And it also made sure that while we do all of this, we want to ensure that the supply of accessible parking spaces isn't reduced. Next slide, please. So in the second draft, we worked with Brent to identify some changes beyond what we had presented in that parking discussion paper. So we've included clarification in the provisions that the only true zero parking are heritage buildings. So the affordable housing, which we're proposing to have no general parking requirement, would be subject to accessible and visitor parking requirements. Rather than allowing the reductions through incentives, we've included reductions where payments might be made under an updated cash in lieu of parking bylaw. So the money from that cash in lieu of parking bylaw, which would be updated, would not be used for parking, but to help to establish a successful car share system in Kingston. So with that, a new car share requirement has been added for multi-unit residential buildings. In PA3 and PA4, the transit corridors, distances have been changed from 400 meters to 600 meters along the corridors, but they've been measured along walking connections. So really looking at the definition of walkable and ensuring that the areas that should benefit from that walkable definition are actually benefiting from the parking provisions in the second draft. The parking maximums for multi-unit residential were reduced to 1 citywide. However, we included new provisions that allow increases of up to 1.25 or 1.5, depending what parking area you're located in, if more car share parking spaces are provided, and if all of the extra spaces are electric vehicle ready. An allowance has been added for up to 10% of the spaces in multi-unit residential to be small car parking spaces. And finally, the draft includes new requirements for electric charging for bike spaces, weather protection for short-term bike spaces, and maintenance areas where there are more than 25 long-term bike spaces. Next slide, please. So on to the topic we've all been waiting for, the actual second draft of the new zoning bylaw and the proposed official plan amendment. So as I stated earlier, since zoning bylaws cover a lot of content and fundamental planning principles, it would be really impossible for us to cover every facet of the document in one presentation. So instead, I'm going to provide a high-level overview of the structure of the second draft and also feature some of the rethink topics that weren't covered specifically by the discussion papers already. Next slide, please. So looking at the zoning bylaw from the ground up, we have the text-based document, which lays out the legal requirements, and we have the corresponding mapping, which identifies different areas of the city. Links to the interactive mapping or links to download the text-based PDF are all available on the project website and the Get Involved Kingston page, which I'll speak to at the end of this presentation. So next slide, please. So starting with the text-based document, all zoning bylaws are written in a pretty similar manner. The second draft of our zoning bylaw includes standard administration, interpretation, and definition sections, which have really been refined based on staff's experiences with similar sections in the existing zoning bylaws to ensure that the document contains appropriate direction dealing with a wide range of potential scenarios. Section 4 contains the general provisions, which cover topics where requirements would be same citywide or across common zones. And some examples of those general provisions would be accessory buildings, amenity area, site triangles, generally permitted or prohibited uses, items that would be exempt from the bylaw, temporary or occasional uses, minimum distance separation requirements, railway, water body, and pipeline setbacks, or walkway or bedroom provisions for residential uses. Section 5 includes the overlay provisions for floodplains, source water protection, airport noise exposure, additional residential units, and the exceptions. So the Section 5 provisions are all connected directly to a series of maps. So that's why they're included in the overlay section. Section 6 includes specific use provisions where there are requirements for certain types of uses, regardless of what zone they're located in. So some examples would be for tiny houses or gas pumps, home occupations or home offices, kennels, marine facilities, model homes, outdoor patios and food trucks, co-living units, backyard hen coops or pigeon lofts, schools and places of worship or stadiums. So they're really meant to address those specific uses regardless of where they're located. The new parking, loading, and bike parking requirements are included in Section 7, and they align with the discussion paper on parking. And then Sections 8 to 19 include the zone requirements, such as the actual permitted uses and building types in the zones. And it includes the performance standards that would apply to really regulate the size and scale of a building, such as height or setbacks from property lines, lot coverage, or landscaped open space. Next slide, please. So sections 20 to 22 are the zoning maps, the overlay schedules, and the non-overlay schedules that correspond with some of the sections that we just talked about. So these are all available on the interactive mapping website. Section 23 and 24 are where the text of the exceptions will eventually live. So any of the exceptions that are passed under the existing zoning bylaws are going to go into section 23 as the legacy exceptions. And then the text of any new or future exceptions that will be passed after this new zoning bylaw is in effect will be passed under section 24. The holding zones and temporary zones, the text of those will be included in sections 25 and 26. And finally, the list of administrative amendments will live at the end of the zoning bylaw in section 27. So anyone who's scrolled through the existing zoning bylaws will probably painfully have scrolled through hundreds of pages of administrative amendments because they tend to be located at the front. So we've tried to locate them at the end of the document to reduce that frustration. So next slide, please. So when creating the second draft, we really identified a desire to use technology to our advantage and to bring the zoning bylaw mapping and the schedules into a format that people can actually use and easily navigate and understand. So the final draft of the new zoning bylaw will include the obligatory PDFs of the maps, since we're required to do this by the legislation, but the everyday experience is expected to rely on the new mapping application that's been developed by our GIS team and planning services. So I'm just going to give a special shout out to our amazing GIS team who have been working very, very hard to create this new mapping platform specifically for this project. So when you click on the mapping, the default map shown is the zoning layer. This is the foundational map of the zoning bylaw, and it identifies the specific zone that applies to every property in the city. So this layer can be turned on or off by clicking the little I that's located next to the zoning layer. All of the overlay and non-overlay schedules have also been added to this interactive map, so they can also be turned on and off with the same eye that's located next to those layers. So a user can zoom in or out of the map, and you also have the ability to search for specific properties using the search tool that has the magnifying glass icon. So up in the top left of the screen, there's a magnifying glass icon that allows you to actually search for individual properties in the city. So I think overall, the mapping experience is vastly improved from the existing zoning bylaws and from the first draft, with the ability to really click on the maps for pop-out windows that display relevant text or applicable zone information. So there's also opportunities for future innovation and new tools to be introduced through this interactive mapping, including the ability to add an advisory overlay that might be helpful for navigating other applicable processes for development that might not be within the zoning bylaw itself, such as like CRCA, Parks Canada, or airport zoning regulations, or just identifying heritage conservation districts, really as just a flag for people that there are other things that you need to look at in these areas beyond just the zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the Central Kingston Growth Strategy, it's ongoing at the same time as this project. The CKGS is studying all of the residentially designated land within the area that's currently subject to zoning bylaw 8499. So it's shown in yellow on the screen in front of you. So through the CKGS work, the official plan and zoning recommendations from the project consultant WSP were presented at a public meeting before the Planning Committee on August 12th. The zoning recommendations for these areas were integrated into the second draft, so including all of the changes to the existing zone requirements, as well as the creation of new intensification areas. So on the CKGS, 2 Q&A sessions are planned for a week from today on October 20th. Staff are continuing to receive feedback on the recommendations and may propose refinements to the zoning recommendations in the final draft of the new zoning bylaw. And then to go along with that, an official plan amendment to add a new section 10G will provide policy guidance for the proposed intensification areas. So this amendment will be separately undertaken this fall. Next slide, please. So one of the rethink topics that wasn't a subject of a discussion paper is the language used to describe residential units, with a focus on removing all distinctions related to the people who live in a unit or the lease or the tenure of a rental agreement. So the definition of dwelling unit in the second draft is intended to be as inclusive as possible to ensure that all residential uses and units are permitted in all residential areas. So the only distinctions that remain in the second draft include group homes and special needs facilities, which are specifically identified with policies in the official plan. One of the recommendations of the Mayor's Task Force on Housing stated that we should welcome co-living buildings where apartments share common areas and rental costs per unit are lowered. So within the second draft of the new zoning bylaw, we've included a new definition of co-living unit, which is currently proposed to be permitted in locations that permit apartment buildings. And it's intended to respond directly to that recommendation of the Mayor's Task Force, and also to help create a new form of housing in Kingston that could potentially result in lower rents. Next slide, please. Okay, so on to the big topic of this evening, the site-specific exceptions. So what are they? They are individual or area-wide amendments to the existing zoning bylaws that typically are a result of applications submitted by an individual property owner. So these are the applications that I think most members of the public and members of planning committee would actually be familiar with, as nearly every rezoning application that's considered at a public meeting at planning committee is requesting some form of site-specific exception to the new zoning bylaw. So at a very basic level, they basically say, despite what the zoning bylaw says on your property, you may only develop it for this specific use, and here are the standards that you must meet. So obviously this is a generalization and there are variations to the ways that exceptions are written, but this is generally the approach that's taken. So when we started preparing the second draft, we knew that the exceptions would be one of the largest tasks that needed to be addressed. The first draft simply said that we will carry forward all of the existing exceptions and recognize those in the new zoning bylaw. So in reviewing this approach, we've identified some potential official plan conformity issues, since we have some zoning bylaws that are around 45 years old, and the current official plan has only been in effect for around 11 years. So it means that there are nearly 35 years of site-specific exceptions that were passed by, at one point, different municipalities in different zoning bylaws than what we have in our current official plan. So before I go any further, as a reminder, the new zoning bylaw must conform with the official plan. When we say this, we don't just mean that the use needs to be a permitted use. All policies of the official plan must be satisfied, including policies that speak to built form, such as land use compatibility, natural heritage, natural hazards, cultural heritage, and urban design policies. So reviewing each exception for conformity against the official plan is actually a really extremely time-consuming task, which requires a really detailed analysis of each provision that's included. When we released the second draft, we put out a companion document highlighting the changes and providing some explanations for the major changes between the first draft and the second draft. In that document, we identified that staff have not determined the appropriate approach for dealing with the old exceptions, and that we're looking for feedback from the public on this topic. So the second draft is formatted in a way to best facilitate this conversation and access the information. So all of the exceptions were pulled into their own schedule rather than being embedded as a number in the zoning map. And the interactive map also shows a pop-up screen if you click on the exception with the actual text of the exception. So right now, if you were to look at the existing zoning bylaws, you actually have to look at the zoning map, find out the number, and then search through the existing zoning bylaw text to find out what the exception actually says. So we've really tried to provide a platform to facilitate this conversation in the best way that we could in the second draft. So the second draft includes color-coded exceptions to categorize the age of the exception. So the green exceptions that you see represent those that were passed after the current official plan came into effect. The red exceptions generally represent those that were passed prior to the current official plan, and they may or may not conform with the official plan. And then a few new exceptions had to be created to better transition from the existing zoning bylaws into the new, or to recognize site-specific policies of the official plan. So these are shown in the blue category. Next slide, please. So two potential options were identified in the second draft highlights document, including, so number one, removing these properties from the new zoning bylaw and giving these properties a hold on all of the relevant mapping, which basically just states that these properties are not subject to the new zoning bylaw. So this would allow for all of the existing permissions to remain in full force and effect without the need to review these exceptions for conformity against the official plan. So this approach would also require that the existing zoning bylaws are not repealed in their entirety, and that the existing zoning bylaws would continue to be applied to these properties and continue to be used by staff and members of the public. And then option number 2 is delete the exceptions and allow for the legal non-conforming use provisions of the Planning Act and the corresponding provisions that we have in section 1.8 of the second draft to apply to these properties without recognizing the existing exceptions. This means that the uses would likely no longer be fully permitted, but recognized as legal non-conforming uses and may continue as long as they're continuously used for that purpose. Next slide, please. So since we released the second draft, we've been working behind the scenes to review some of the area-wide exceptions that were previously shown in the red category when the second draft was released. So we've undertaken this work because they generally represent the larger residential subdivisions and they impact a very large number of properties across the city. So from an OP review standpoint, they also represent some of the exceptions that are easier to review for conformity against the official plan, since they're often dealing with prescribed lot areas and lot frontages and other standards that apply to low-rise residential development and residentially designated lands. So we currently hope to move as many of these exceptions as possible into the green category before we make any kind of final recommendations on this project to ensure that the new zoning bylaw applies to a large majority of the properties in the city. Next slide, please. So when we look at the numbers and the maps, I think the most impactful statistic is shown in the left-hand pie chart on your screen. So out of all of the properties in the city, all 41,899 of them, 51% of the properties are currently subject to a site-specific exception. So that means that more than half of the properties in the city are currently subject to an exception. So when we've been doing this exercise of moving those larger area-wide residential exceptions from the red category into the yellow category, we've captured an additional 15,586 properties. So about 37% of the city are covered in those larger area-wide exceptions. So when we're talking about what to do with the red exceptions, those old exceptions that predate the official plan, what we're looking at here are about 1,911 properties that are impacted by a red exception, which represents about 5% of the properties in the city. So to sum it all up, I know I gave you a great deal of information about the exceptions. I think it's a really important topic and a fundamental component of the second draft that we're really looking for feedback from the public and members of planning committee and council on. So we will be requesting direction from council at the special meeting of council on November 9th to ensure that we have clarity leading into the final statutory open house and public meeting. But this is a really important component that I'm hoping that we can receive some additional feedback from the public on. Next slide, please. So when we were putting together the discussion papers and the second draft, we identified several areas where amendments to the official plan would actually allow us to draft zoning requirements that implement the intent of the official plan policies in a more appropriate manner. So the majority of the proposed amendments were already covered by the various discussion paper topics. And the only changes that are proposed to the mapping of the OP relate specifically to the riparian corridors, which were addressed in the environmental protection areas. Discussion paper. So some additional amendments have been proposed to the on-farm diversified uses and agricultural related uses and complementary use provisions within employment areas. So we've proposed some amendments to ensure that these uses can actually proceed through a straightforward minor variance application where they're appropriate, with specific intention identified in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw. That they're really unique uses that require some detailed review before we broadly broadly permit them, but we wanted to ensure that they have specific criteria established in the official plan, and then they can proceed through the minor variance through enabling language in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw. So next slide, please. So as a very quick reminder on the project timeline, we're hoping to receive all public comments on the second draft by the end of the day on November 5th. We have the special meeting of council coming up on November 9th, where we'll be seeking direction related to those red exceptions. And then our goal is to bring a final version of the zoning bylaw for consideration at a statutory open house and statutory public meeting in early 2022 before council's consideration of the recommendations. Next slide, please. So there are many ways that members of the public can provide comments and access the second draft and the proposed official plan amendment. So while the agenda package, which yes, it's 516 pages long, it includes the majority of the information with all links to the relevant documents and maps in the report. The information can be found on both the project website as well as the Get Involved Kingston webpage. I'm also maintaining a project email list where updates are sent when new documents are published or new events are scheduled. Written comments can be sent via email or mail, and we are available anytime to speak on the phone or meet virtually with interested members of the public. Next slide, please. I wanted to provide one final plug for the Get Involved Kingston website. So we're actually hosting a new public commenting platform that offers an alternative way to provide feedback on the text document. So the program's called Conveyo. People can drop comments in the document itself, see comments from other people, and reply to comments to start a conversation. So the Conveyo platform is just an extra way to provide feedback. Traditional ways can are obviously still accepted. So we'll be closing the commenting through Conveyo on November 5th, and we'll include a summary of the Conveyo comments in the report for the special meeting of council. Next slide, please. And with that, I think our formal presentation is over, and I'll hand it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And you had 5 minutes to spare. I'm impressed. We'll now open this up to the public to give them an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. Just a reminder that members of the public have 5 minutes to discuss it. In our meeting, in our pre-meeting today, there was some discussion, given the complexity of this, of allowing for an extra minute or two. I'll test if somebody wanted to move that as a motion. The committee can vote on it, and we can make it a 7-minute comment. I think I saw Councillor Kiley's hand up. Is there a seconder for that? Seconded by Councillor Hutchison. I'll call that question. We have to do this formally because our bylaw specifies 5 minutes. So all those in favor and opposed? Councillor Asanic, I didn't see your hand. Were you in favor of that or opposed? I wonder if Councillor Asanic can hear me. Actually, it passed, I believe, by a 3-2 vote. So that gives us an opportunity to allow for a little bit of extra time. Hopefully this won't go on to become a midnight meeting. So, Madam Clerk, yes, if you want to bring up people 3 at a time, and then we'll have an opportunity for people to answer questions at that from the first 3, then we'll go on to the next 3. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, we do have a couple hands up already, but just before we get started, a reminder to those who are joining us this evening that we will require you to use the raise hand function in Zoom in order for us to call on you. For those who are joining us via computer, That is found in the center of your screen when you move the mouse over the Zoom window. For those who are joining us by phone, you will need to press *9 in order to raise your hand. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm going to start with Bill Kennedy and ask if he can unmute.
Thank you. Mr. Kennedy, the floor is yours if you wish to unmute. Thank you.
Bill. Hello, Bill Kennedy here. How you doing, you guys? Anyway,
Good.
got a couple of comments here. The official plan is an excellent document. I like the way it was written. But then when you look at the bylaws, and I'm a guy that believes in common sense, and that's a rare commodity in this world. And you look at the bylaws, and I don't know if they conform with the official plan. There seems to be a little bit of overstep there, and no reasonableness or flexibility. And common sense says, when you look at the city map, what is the biggest area color? It's rural, it's brown. And I don't see a discussion paper on what is special about the rural area. This seems to be a city focus, this planning exercise. I think a technical group should have been, a task force should have been, worked up with a farmer on it or somebody and talked about rural issues. What's going on in rural issues? What do we got now? We got COVID. Where are people going? They don't want to stay in the city. They want to go to the country. Two, there's, you've got great goals here. Simplify, modernize, but you're missing a goal. Getting rid of red tape. What's going on? One of the biggest issues in Canada, Ontario, Kingston right now is housing affordability. What are we doing about that? Shouldn't that be a goal in the planning exercise too? And, you're looking at rural properties here. You want to increase them in size. Farmer can't sever it off when he wants to retire and sell his house and sell his land to another farmer. He's got to have a 2.5 acre house to sell off. He can't shrink it down. You can't build on smaller properties. But isn't Kingston the place of history and innovation? And what do we have? We have aerobic septic systems now, bulber systems. You can put them on small lot sizes. There's so much innovation that can reduce lot sizes in the rural community. And what else do I want to say here? Yeah, besides that, oh, yes. Because the city focuses always on the city, I think you guys need some experts, one or two people that are rural experts in planning, because it's obvious that is missing. That foresight and hindsight's missing. And when you're doing an official plan like this, you're looking at what do we want down the road? Where are we going? And it just seems to be missing. What is going to happen in the next 10 years, 2 decades in the rural community? And if these city bylaws, they appear to be mostly city bylaws that got transferred to the rural area. And you know what's going to happen? Most people are going to go underground. They are going to ignore you and those city bylaws. You got to come up with something that's common sensible and compatible with country living. I myself, that's my lifestyle. Most of the small dairy farms are disappearing. What's left is idle land. The forest is creeping in, secondary succession. And you got idle land. Most of the dairy farms are disappearing. What's going to happen with these lands? What do we want happen on these lands? We need a rural focus. It's missing in this planning exercise. And even the EPA, well, you could grandfather those people that, have their properties in EPA lands right away, but heck, don't let them build their sheds close to that waterway. They could put pesticides in those sheds, hydrocarbons, gasoline. You could have the spills, goes into the waterway. That EPA document could have been done in 2 pages of schedule saying we're grandfathering, bang, bang, done. And nobody mentioned those 2 huge provincially significant wetlands we have. We have huge significant wetlands in Kingston. We got the Collins Creek, massive wetland. We got the Cataract River, massive wetland. They are BBCs of our ecosystem and our planet. They are biofilters degrading human pollutants. They provide biodiversity, and the sea is carbon sequesters to combat global warming. So folks, in summary, We need a rural focus, and my wife, she had something to say as well. Here you are, beautiful.
Bill gets rather excited. What he was saying about the sheds is he thinks that you're allowing sheds too close to the water. And he's saying, what if people put pesticides in there, or their fertilizer, or any kind of hazardous things, they might not know. Accidental spills, they might not know that they're doing anything wrong, but they might. So he would prefer to see sheds away from the waterfront. I
Absolutely.
think that was his point.
Talk to the Ministry of Environment about that. That's very important. So is that all we have to say?
And I think what he was saying, a separate staff member, I think he was saying like a person devoted specifically to the rural bylaw rules and the technical details, that's not used to dealing with all the rules and the technical details of the city, because it's totally different. And then when the rural people phone in, it's always like, these are the rules, and they've been developed over all these years for city properties. And so it's a leap for the staff to think in rural terms. And so if you had a separate staff member, so if somebody called in from a rural area, there'd be a separate staff member that does the rural area and deals with those questions, and doesn't really focus back on what was done for the city, or what the rules have been for the city for all those years. What rules do we need for the rural properties? Because I'm not sure that what was done, maybe there was something done when you took over the township, but you know, a 10 by 10 shed in a rural area is not sufficient. And there's no reason why there needs to be a 10 by 10 shed in the rural area, because that's the rule for, you know, a lot that's 30 feet versus a lot that's 6,000 feet. So I just think if you had a separate staff member who could focus on the rural issues and have time to think them through without, you know, answering phone calls or whatever else they need to do with all the city questions, they could focus just on the rural. So that's just a suggestion in terms of focusing. You know, give us a person that's rurally trained, has lived in a rural environment or whatever. A person, like, we don't want to have to go to a counselor. We don't want to have to go, you know, here, there, everywhere. Go to a planner, go to a lawyer. We don't want to have to. Okay, I'm finished. Thank you very much for our comments.
Thank you very much. And who's next, Elizabeth?
Mr. Chair, next to speak is Jacqueline Collier.
Hi there. Can you hear me all right?
We can, loud and clear.
Thank you. Good evening. Thanks for the opportunity to speak this evening. Thank you to Laura for the presentation, and to the committee for the work you do. I know the time and commitment involved, and it's much appreciated. I'm speaking tonight as a concerned citizen. I'm someone who sits on many boards and committees in relation to housing. I'm chair of the city's Housing and Homelessness Advisory Committee, as well as chair of the board with Habitat for Humanity, Kingston Limestone Region, and a director with the KHBA. And my day job is in residential construction as well, in that field. I have a strong passion for housing, as you can see. Through the committees and boards noted, I've gained much insight and see firsthand the need for housing affordability. The lot area, lot coverage, and yard setback requirements, when read together in the proposed zoning bylaw, will result in larger lots that undermine the province and city's goals for residential intensification and efficient land use. These standards would result in communities that are not consistent with what council has been approving in the last couple of decades, in particular with respect to housing density, which has a direct impact on affordability. The larger side yard requirement would mean fewer homes can be built on a given street, thus drastically lowering the availability of homes and increasing the cost of each new home, which then directly impacts affordability of all housing, further increasing the barriers to entry for home buyers and putting the dream of homeownership even farther out of reach to working families. There is a domino effect here, and its consequences go far beyond what initially seems to be just bigger side yards. We must ensure as a city that we keep this in mind. We need all the housing that can be built. It has an impact towards mitigating the housing crisis. I strongly urge that this be reconsidered. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. And who's our third presenter?
Mr. Chair, next to speak is Mike Keane.
Mr. Keane, the floor is yours.
Right. Good evening, Mr. Chair. My name is Mike Keene, and I'm a land use planner with Foten Consultants located at 4 Cataract Street, which is the woolen mill. And our firm's had the chance to review the zoning bylaw on behalf of about a dozen different applicants at this point. And I want to start by complimenting staff on where they're at today in terms of the discussion papers and the bylaw format itself. All of us are finding it's a great format, and you know, while we of course have our specific issues that we'll want to address with staff, we really are happy with the way this is going right now. We've submitted letters to address those specific concerns, so I don't plan to bring those up with the committee this evening, and we'll continue to work with staff. I did want to touch on the older site-specific exceptions, those red boxes that Laura was speaking to a few minutes ago. And in our findings, we're actually finding that many of those red exceptions, even though they're older, they actually still conform to the official plan. So when we've been going through it, we've been actually finding that they're actually okay, and we've been trying to bring those specific parcels to staff's attention. So I appreciate what's being said. There's almost 2,000 properties that have these red exceptions. I think that's a very critical issue to be examined. And, you know, I think it might be a case of both examples that were brought up, the whole principle, as well as actually looking at the policies, or rather the site-specific properties, and bringing them into compliance. So what I mean by that is that it is an absolute critical issue, and it's not one that can be taken lightly, because there are cases where people sought site-specific bylaws 10 years ago, let's say, or even longer ago, and haven't actually built on those properties. So they've gone through a process, and because bylaws are law, they assume they've kind of maintained this right. And now they need to proceed with building. So it's a very sensitive issue. And I think a combination of what I've just mentioned is probably ideal for that. So those are really all my points that I'd like to bring up this evening. So thank you for the chance to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Keene. How many more hands are currently up, Madam Chair, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Chair, we have 2 hands at the moment.
Okay, let's go to our staff to answer those questions already asked, and then we'll go back, and I'm sure there'll be a third hand raised by then. So thank you. So who among our planning staff would like to address those questions asked? Yes, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair, I'm going to answer the questions that were raised tonight about some of the rural questions we have out there, especially as it relates to existing development rights. And so what I'm going to start with is the questions about severing lots in rural areas. So in rural areas, there are 2 primary land use designations we mostly deal with, and that is the prime agricultural designation and the rural designation. And each of them has different severing abilities. So I know a question was brought up about the difficulty of farmers creating lots in rural areas to retire, as well as the ability to just create lots in general in rural areas. And what I understand from the zoning bylaw project is that we are not updating any sort of rural land use designations at this time. The zoning is just being updated to reflect the existing land use designations. For prime agricultural lands, the PPS and our OP are very straightforward in how they approach them. You can only create real lots in prime agricultural land, which are our most valuable protected agricultural lands, through farm consolidation, where a farmer can buy additional lands, or a farmer could sever off the remaining house and live in it and sell the remaining farmlands to an additional farmer. Now, those farmlands are exempt from having additional residential capabilities, so they are just farmland afterwards. For our rural lands, we do still allow lot creation for 2 new lots from an original parcel from a specific date, depending on the township that you're in. So both of those considerations will remain as part of any new zoning bylaw updated project. But I understand that there are new provisions related to farm consolidation lots, and those are actually pretty positive when it comes to severing those lots, because they could be done in a capability where they could be zone compliant with the provisions that are being put forward. So it could just involve a delegated authority consent and not necessarily any sort of minor variance or zoning bylaw amendment. The second part I want to talk about today, and I know Laura touched on it briefly, is the provisions that we're bringing forward for on-farm diversified uses and agriculture-related uses. These are kind of two new umbrella terms that the province put out with the 2014 PPS, and that municipalities have been implementing over time since then. And our 2017 zoning bylaw, or sorry, official plan update contained regulations that said on-farm diversified uses and agriculture-related uses are permitted in prime agricultural and rural lands. Now, what it didn't do is it didn't provide any parameters for what that exactly looks like, and it didn't provide any sort of development criteria and how to actually action them. And now the PPS actually contains a lot of framework for this. And what we're trying to do to actually action part of this for the rural areas, to give the rural areas more development capabilities, is establish appropriate official plan frameworks to action upon those two key items, whereby farmers or rural landowners would be able to proceed via a minor variance in order to develop those specific uses. On-farm diversified uses include things like winery operations, small cafes. Sometimes it could even be the wagon rides or other kind of rural tourist commercial uses that currently are not permitted by our zoning bylaw, but something that we're looking to implement for this round. And agriculture related uses is everything from an abattoir to a cheese factory and other things that are meant to support agriculture and agricultural uses. So the new zoning bylaw project is actually putting forward a solid path in order to actually have these uses be easily actioned by rural landowners. I think that's all I have for that topic at this moment. So I'd be happy to turn it back over to Ms. Flaherty for the other answers to other questions.
Thank you. Hello, Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So just to thank you, Mr. Barr, for your explanation about the on-farm diversified uses and the agricultural related uses. To touch on Mr. Kennedy's comments and Ms. Kennedy's comments, in the new zoning bylaw, certainly when we speak about harmonizing, modernizing the new zoning bylaw, we really are talking about getting rid of red tape wherever we can. Obviously, there are a number of reasons and rationales for a lot of the zoning provisions that are included, but I think one of the fundamental principles that we've tried to bring in creating the second draft is creating a document that generalizes the uses and to also create a document that really supports housing, the creation of new housing and housing affordability in the city. So all of the work that we've done has really focused on those elements. And I certainly, if I didn't say that in our presentation, when I was describing some of the key goals that we've set in creating the second draft, certainly removing red tape where it currently exists. I think one of the great examples of that would be, if you look at the existing zoning bylaws and the employment lands, there are some extremely specific uses that are permitted. I think there might be permissions for like neon sign manufacturing plants. So there are extremely specific uses that are currently permitted. So the approach that we've taken to remove red tape is to ensure that we're allowing for a broader defined term of heavy industrial or general or light industrial uses within the appropriate zones and allow for innovation to happen. We obviously don't know what new uses are going to happen in the future. So we've tried to take a lens in writing this zoning bylaw in a way that really focuses on the fundamental land use piece without the specific mention of the products that are being manufactured to ensure that we're allowing for that innovation in the future. So I think number one, I wanted to say that I know Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy, some of the comments that you've provided are related to a shed on a vacant property in a rural area. And we're certainly reviewing your comments that you've provided and looking for opportunities to allow for additional recreational abilities on rural land. So it's certainly a comment that we've received, and we are reviewing in the context of what our appropriate recommendations are in that regard. Ms. Collier, certainly thank you very much for your comments related to the side yards and the larger lots undermining the ability to provide for new housing and more dense housing in the city. It's certainly a comment that I've received from a number of home builders related specifically right now to the UR3 zone provisions so far. So there have been comments and questions about how we've arrived at the interior side yard setbacks that were proposed in the UR3 zone, which I believe are 3.6 meters, whereas the current standards are 1.2. So certainly a question that we're looking into and ensuring that before we make recommendations, we rectify the issue to ensure that the residential standards are really reflective of the built form and the densities that we want to see within the urban boundary today. And Mr. Keane, thank you for your comments and the compliments on the work that we've done so far. Obviously, we just received all of your letters, so we'll be in touch with you about the detailed correspondence that you have with your clients' individual properties. I appreciate the feedback that you've provided on the site-specific exceptions. Certainly, when we identified the close to 2,000 properties in the red category, we didn't say that for sure these don't conform with the official plan. It's just that there's a potential that they might not conform with the official plan. So I appreciate your feedback in that regard.
Thank you very much. And just a quick comment for those of us that aren't here every 2 weeks. PPS stands for Provincial Policy Statement, and that's the province saying, for instance, in what's allowed for severance on rural land, and that trumps anything that we do in zoning bylaws. So we have to meet all of the requirements of the PPS. And so severance in rural areas, I know is a touchy subject, but it's pretty much governed by the province. And if any planner wants to contradict me, please do. But I think that's the way it is. So who are our next 2 or 3? Elizabeth.
Mr. Chair, next to speak is Dustin Green.
Okay. Mr. Green, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dustin Green. I'm here tonight to speak on behalf of the Kingston Home Builders Association. First, I'd like to applaud Laura for a very thorough and informative presentation, and for the rest of our team for the amount of work that they've done in such a short period of time. Now, I'd like to remind everyone of a few themes in the city's strategic plan and how they relate to housing. The first theme is to demonstrate leadership on climate change action through promoting ways for residents to reduce their energy use. Today, housing built to minimum standards is 15% more energy efficient than those built just 5 years ago. So moving into a new, more energy efficient house is a choice that a Kingstonian can make that will reduce their carbon footprint today. The next theme is housing affordability. It's widely known that all levels of government have decided that an increase in housing supply is needed to tackle this problem. So more housing is basically a win-win scenario here. Not to mention it's a new home. It's a place where families can make lifelong memories. Now, getting to the new zoning bylaw, we understand zoning here in Kingston needs to be updated. Things need to get current. Some of these zones are from the 70s. They're so out of date that it's standard practice for a developer to apply for a zoning bylaw amendment just to change the performance standards to ones that are current. Now, these site-specific zones do have an exemption in regards to the new zoning bylaw, but the requirements brought forward are even more old-fashioned in the current zoning, and new requirements that are unnecessary have also been added, which will affect future lands. They impose larger lot frontages and setback requirements. Basically, a larger lot will be needed for the same size of house, up to 40% larger in some cases. This is an efficient use of land and will either lead to less housing supply and higher prices, or will be in the same time-consuming zoning bylaw amendment process that we're currently in. But both of these cases and in a missed opportunity to solve future headaches today. This is also the addition of minimum lot area. Minimum lot areas have not been used for over 10 years as lot frontages are used for determining servicing and density requirements in a development. The addition of max lot coverage seems like an obvious choice to prevent overdevelopment as well, but the minimum landscaped open space, in addition to front, rear, and side yard setbacks, already do this. So adding max lot coverage is something that is not needed. Yard setbacks have been dramatically increased as well. Side yard setbacks are increased from 1.2 meters to 3.6 meters in some cases. This is threefold increase, and it would make subdivisions look like they're from the 70s again, with large yards and little houses. As a result, there will be lower densities, less supply, and ultimately less families are given the opportunity to switch to a greener choice for housing. When diving into it, it's easy to see how the zones don't sync up with how things are today. When you look at the new zoning map, it's easy to tell that many of these new zones are put on areas in the city in regards to the type of zone and not on the zone's current performance standards. Since there is a large number of these site-specific zones, it would be a very time-consuming process, and we understand that city staff simply does not have enough time to make these checks. So, as an association, since the majority of our residential subdivisions have very similar site-specific zones, we came up with a new zone that has been vetted by our members. We believe that city staff should apply this zone to current and future subdivision lands. This new zone would bring the new zoning bylaw current, so amendments to a new policy aren't needed out of the gate. To be clear, they would still be required to go through the subdivision approval process, but it was essentially kickstart zones to this stage. We believe this new zone would be a simple approach to help fix the housing supply shortage, as well as the added benefit of reducing workloads for us all at the same time. That is my presentation. I'd like to thank everyone here tonight for their time and consideration in this matter.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Who's next, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Chair, next to speak is Yuko Leclerc.
Thank you. The floor is yours.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. And my name is Yuko Leclerc. I am a planner with FOTEN Planning and Design. And I'm here this evening speaking on behalf of the Taggart and Cataract groups of companies. We have submitted a letter with our comments, but it didn't make it into the addendum this evening, so I was hoping to speak to those comments briefly tonight. I'll start by echoing my colleagues and others tonight and complimenting staff. The new zoning bylaw is really going in the right direction in so many ways. The document itself is so much more user-friendly, a lot easier to understand, a lot more consistent with contemporary zoning bylaws that we see in a lot of other municipalities. And it also brings in best practices in many ways in land use planning. Consistency with the PPS and with the city's official plan is there as well. So this approach is one that we're very happy to see come forward, as is the long anticipated standardization of zones throughout the city of Kingston. So we're very happy with that. Of course, we do have some comments with the zoning bylaw itself. One of the outcomes that we're all hoping for from this new zoning bylaw exercise is a general reduction and simplification of zoning bylaw amendment applications. We know they're not going to go away. They will still be needed, but we want to see them reduced, the number of them and the degree to which we're amending the zoning bylaw. The only way that we can really do that is by incorporating performance standards and provisions in the new zoning bylaw that are consistent with contemporary build form and reflective of current policy and best practices. Now, Ms. Flaherty spoke to this earlier in her presentation and acknowledging that the current draft of the bylaw carries forward the performance standards that were identified in the very first sort of phase of the new zoning bylaw project, which is a consolidation of the 5 outdated zoning bylaws that we have in the city. So the performance standards that are reflected in the zones in the draft bylaw that we're looking at now are sort of a Frankenstein version of the zones from the performance standards from the 1970s and 1990s. So they're by and large, we're not seeing performance standards in these zones that are reflective of this of the performance standards that have been adopted by council over the last 5 to 10 years, particularly in new community development. So as Mr. Green was saying, the Kingston Home Builders Association is putting together a zone and has shared a zone with staff. And our intention and our hope is to work with staff through FOTEN and with our clients at Cataract to craft, to work with the zone and refine it so that it meets the needs of the home building community at large, and have this zone incorporated into the new zoning bylaw, either by replacing one of the existing zones. Ms. Flaherty spoke to the UR3 as an example, whether it's replacing that zone or being added in as a new zone. This would significantly simplify the process for staff, for the public, and for council when applying to rezone lands, rather than taking a zone from, which is the current practice where when we rezone lands for a new community, we take one of the zones in the zoning bylaw and we basically rewrite it because the standards from the 1970s are just no longer consistent with what good planning represents today. So we take the zone, we completely rewrite it, and we have to explain and justify every change that we're making in the zoning bylaw, which leads to confusion and leads to uncertainty. If we are able to come up with a zone that staff agree with and that reflects those zones, the standards that have been supported by staff and council over the last 10 years, it means that when we're applying to rezone lands to this new zone, we're just justifying the rezoning exercise itself and not having to go through every provision and explain why it needs to be changed. So it simplifies the process for everyone. It'll also standardize the process of the building permit review process, rather than building officials having to be familiar with 200 different zones. They'll have, a smaller group of zones, maybe even just one zone that they need to be intimately familiar with, and make their lives a lot easier, and the building permit review process significantly easier and faster, and therefore sort of help homes get to the market faster. So our hope is that this new zone would be incorporated into the new zoning bylaw. We understand that this new zoning bylaw exercise is also looking to upzone certain areas of the city where there have been planning exercises that support intensification or new development. So examples of that are the Central Kingston growth strategy along the Johnson and Brock corridors, Williamsville, which has recently been rezoned. So there are certain areas of the city where planning exercises have said, this is a good area for intensification, for new development. Well, that exercise has already been done in other areas of the city as well. I think one of the more significant examples over the last 10-ish years is the Cataract West secondary plan, where a master plan exercise was undertaken and then incorporated into the official plan as a secondary plan. This is an area where council felt that development was supportable, and detailed parameters and policies for development of those lands were set out and are reflected in the policy framework. The principle of development on these lands is established. There's a desire to see this land developed for residential use. So it makes sense then, if the effort of the new zoning bylaw is to, I think it was described this evening as sort of reducing the red tape, to pre-zone some of these lands where they aren't already zoned for residential use. With holding provisions, of course, so that developers still have to go through, and applicants still have to go through the exercise of the technical servicing and subdivision process. But it makes sense for some of these lands to be pre-zoned, and our clients own some lands in these areas where it just makes sense. So we speak to that a little bit in our letter in a little bit more detail. Finally, just a couple of other items. There are a number of exception zones. I think the number was discussed earlier. It's significant. One of the outcomes we'd love to see with this new zoning bylaw is the number of exception zones reduced in the city of Kingston. Rather than carrying forward 20,000 new exception zones, if there's an opportunity for staff to work with property owners and review the performance standards and refine the performance standards of the new zoning bylaw, and apply a parent zone from the new zoning bylaw to lands that are currently subject to a site-specific or exception zone. Instead of carrying forward the exception zone,
30 seconds, please.
Thank you. It would significantly simplify the process for those property owners in the future to develop on those lands if they're intended for development. It would also reduce the number of exception zones in the city, of which we have so many. And my last comment is regarding the exception zones and legacy exception zones. We are working with staff. There are a number of such zones that are owned by our clients. Staff are already identifying, and Ms. Flaherty has identified a number of them that could be brought forward into the new zoning bylaw as in conformity with the OP. We've reviewed them and
thank you very much.
rationale. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there another hand up?
Yes, Mr. Chair, next to speak is Curtis Branscombe.
Okay. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and through you, Chair, I thank you guys first and foremost for yielding additional time. I hope not to take that additional time, but I work for a local builder, the Merck, and we have site-specific exceptions that we'll raise with the city. But I was hoping more than anything just to further my understanding of the process and maybe help facilitate that understanding for other members of the public and members of the planning committee. And specifically, I guess we've heard some conversation about intensification as it pertains to the low-rise form or the subdivisions. But more specifically, what I'd like to sort of understand is the process for the mid to high-rise forms of intensification. There seemed to be, from our review, a very careful implementation of the second draft with regard to the Williamsville area and some of the central growth areas. As an example, I think there's this CM2 zone and the URM12 and CM1 zones that permit buildings that might be above the 6-story limit. And within those zones, I think there's about a dozen or 2 dozen all contained within that area. Outside of that area, there doesn't appear to be any density permitted or height permitted in the remainder of the city. And I guess from my understanding, and I welcome staff to help clarify my understanding if it's wrong. And unfortunately, we do have Mr. Todern here today, and maybe he can speak to it. But what appears to be the approach, as far as I can tell, is that the zoning bylaw took precedent over some of the iterative work that was underway. And specifically, I'm referring to density by design and also to the North Kingstown master plan. And so there doesn't appear to be an inclusion of either of those works being incomplete works or works that haven't been brought to council. And I guess my understanding is that this zoning will be passed first, and then these other works will follow along in the form of a zoning bylaw amendment or official plan amendment as it may occur. So that we although we don't see density or intensification direction here today, that work is to come. And I guess to aid in the understanding of that is just to understand how those timelines may work. If there's delays in density by design or the North Kingstown plan, how would one expect development to be directed with a new zoning bylaw that doesn't include those elements, and that is perhaps waiting for those elements to be later amended? Hopefully I've made my question or my clarification understood. If I haven't, I'm open to clarifying it further.
I believe that was very understandable. Thank you. Madam Clerk, are there any other hands up at this time?
Mr. Chair, we don't currently have any other hands. Perhaps we
Okay.
could go to some responses and then do a final call.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. So we'll go back to our planning staff to respond to those questions and comments. So, Secreti, I do see your hand in the corner. You're on.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to start with responding to Mr. Branscome's comments about medium and high density residential development and how this type of development will be considered through the new zoning bylaw, as well as I'll just kind of give a high level overview of the process that we are anticipating to take with the density by design project. So, as you know, the city undertook amendments to the official plan and the zoning bylaw specifically related to Williamsville. And our approach with density by design is that we will be proceeding with that project on an area specific basis. So, so the first area that was considered was Williamsville. The second area that is proposed to be looked into next year is the downtown area, and then there will be future phases through that project. What our approach is going to be at this point is, as and when any associated official plan amendments and zoning bylaw amendments are passed by council, so those would be future amendments to our new zoning bylaw, and they will be incorporated by way of council approved amendments. Also, I just wanted to highlight our official plan policies as they relate to medium and high density residential development. So the OP is really clear that any medium or high density residential development would be able to proceed through a rezoning process. So our approach is not really to pre-zone medium or high density residential developments because they are mostly reviewed on a site specific case by case basis based on the locational criteria that has been included in the official plan with respect to medium and high density residential developments. Thanks, and I will pass it on to Ms. Flaherty for the other questions.
Yes, Ms. Flaherty.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Green, for your comments related to housing affordability and the creation of more housing. So certainly we will review the submissions that you provided today in much greater detail to take a look at the performance standards that you've identified as being more reflective and consistent with the standards that the KHBA and all of its members would like to see in those newer residential subdivision areas. Certainly, I think the comments that both you and Mr. Leclerc have provided are aligned in the sense that you've identified concerns related to performance standards that we're proposing in residential areas, and the fact that some of the D zones within the CAT West haven't been pre-zoned for residential, despite the secondary plan work that was done in those areas. So we're taking those comments internally. We'll review them and see if there are ways to amend the official plan in amend the second draft of the new zoning bylaw in a manner that we think is more reflective of some of the current standards, and ensure that those standards aren't just a legacy of that consolidation exercise, which they currently are. And it was really the effort of the consultant who put together the first draft. So we'll certainly commit to reviewing the residential standards, specifically in the UR3 zone and the other zones, to ensure that the approach is appropriate from a citywide zoning bylaw perspective. Just taking a look to see if there are any other specific questions. I think I've addressed at a high level the comments, but if there are more specific comments or questions that you think I should be providing feedback on, I'm happy to do so.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, is there anybody else waving at you?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have another further two hands at this time. So we'll start with Chris Hargreaves.
Yes, the floor is yours, Chris.
Thank you. Chris Hargreaves, 4060 Bath Road, Kingston, Ontario. Speaking and listening to the debate as chair of the Conservation Committee of the Kingston Field Naturalists. I noticed a couple of comments earlier on by presenters with regarding to the problem of affordable housing, which is without doubt a major issue. It has got a lot of attention recently, but there's another issue which has also got a lot of attention recently, which has been mental health issues created by people who, as a result of COVID-19 and other restrictions, are having to spend more and more time indoors and have less and less time to get outdoors. And this is going to create a dilemma for the planners in terms of what is the optimum size of a lot if you're going to balance off affordability with the ability to have some open space outside. And I would be very interested to hear the planners' comments on how they're going to go about balancing the requirements of those two major problems. Thank you.
Thank you. And who's next, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Chair, next to speak is Ken Dancer.
Mr. Dancer.
Hello, Ken Dancer, Cataract Development, 234 concession. Specific to the comment that a higher development would specifically commonly require rezoning, including applying for height. I very much agree with that. However, keeping the zoning low, such as 3 stories, if you can please confirm my understanding is correct. If you keep zone at 3 stories and people zone for a higher number of floors or increased height, that will specifically make the as of right lower and therefore the community benefit calculation worse. Of course, my reason for bringing this up is height is directly related to efficiency of construction. Height is related to density and therefore the affordability of the sale or rent of the units within. And community benefit is specifically affects affordability. If you can confirm my understanding that that we need to talk further about a 3-story limit on most zones. Thank you.
Thank you. Was that all the hands currently raised?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. Currently, that is it for the hands. We'll just maybe do a final call. So if there's anyone else who wishes to speak at this time, if you could please raise your hand in Zoom so that we may call on you. Mr. Chair, I see no further hands.
Thank you very much. So we will now go back to the planning staff to comment on those questions and comments. Ms. Flaherty.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think I'll go first and then I might pass it off to Ms. Agarwal. Mr. Hargreaves, thank you for your comments. Certainly, when we look at creating zoning on a citywide basis, we have to consider all of the elements that we consider on a site-specific basis. So when we review rezoning applications, it's really easy to take a look at the proposed lot fabric within a residential subdivision and identify where there's a need to increase certain lots to ensure that the function and the layout of those lots is appropriate with the zoning provisions. So oftentimes the zoning provisions are actually catered specifically to the layout and the functionality on the lots, rather than saying, here are the standards for all of these new residential zones, and let's just make sure that that's what dictates the form and function of those lots. So I think often when we're reviewing rezoning applications to establish those standards, it's really about looking at that function and form of the lot. When we talk about residential standards, there certainly are landscaping requirements that would specifically require outdoor space for each individual lot that's created. So there are built-in protections, but it's certainly part of the process when we're reviewing applications for rezoning and draft plan of subdivision. So when we talk about creating the standards on a citywide basis, we can't just look at the standards without thinking about all of the potential ways that those standards will apply. So every lot in the city is unique, and it has a different context and a different shape and a different context with surrounding land uses. So major changes to create new zoning standards are something that we typically do through a very detailed policy planning study, which is some of the work that Ms. Agrawal was speaking to earlier with the density by design and upzoning specific areas for increased height. We have to review the built form in its specific context. So the creation of the new zoning bylaw, it was founded as a consolidation through the earlier terms of reference in the first draft to ensure that the existing standards, which are currently in effect and reflective by and large of the residential character of a lot of the existing residential neighborhoods, that was the reason that it was created as a consolidation in the first place. So when we're talking about taking another look at the standards, it's in the context of what are those existing standards that apply in those communities, and ensuring that they're appropriate for the given context. So at a high level, I couldn't tell you that there's an exact formula of balancing this specific amount of amenity area or layout on a lot versus this specific amount of density. It's certainly something that is something we review on a site-specific and area-wide basis through detailed review. So going through and reviewing the comments, we will certainly have to take a detailed dive into the recommendations about changes to the residential standards to ensure that they tick all of the boxes and meet all of the policies of the official plan. And I think with that, I'll pass it over to Ms. Agrawal.
Great. Ms. Agrawal.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to quickly touch on that community benefit question from Mr. Dancer. So the province amended Section 37 of the Planning Act, which will now require municipalities to prepare a community benefits charges strategy and a community benefits bylaw. And this is a very different approach from the height and density bonusing or community benefits, like what we call today. So going forward, the new community benefits could only be requested for any development that would have more than 10 units and more than 5 stories in height. So we are currently in a transition period. The province has provided up to September of 2022 for municipalities to prepare that strategy and bylaw for council's approval. So going forward, it will be a different approach. So in that case, yes, if a lot only allowed for 3 stories, however, if a height greater than 5 stories was proposed, then yes, community benefit charges could apply. However, that would need to be detailed within that strategy, which staff will be undertaking in 2022 and bring forward for council's consideration before that September 2022 deadline provided by the province. Thanks.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, are there any more waving hands?
Mr. Chair, we don't have any further hands at this time.
Okay, thank you very much to all members of the public that have brought forward their concerns. We will now go to the committee Quick show of hands. Would anybody appreciate a 10-minute recess? Councillor Kiley, Councillor Hutchison, and myself. So we will take a 10-minute recess and come straight back. Thank you. So I think we're back on. If Councillor Kiley, Councillor Osanek, and oh, there's Councillor Kiley. It's been a long day. Councillor Hutchison and Councillor Osanek, you can join us. So we'll now go back into committee questions. I just want to remind the committee that this is being a public meeting. There's no decision point tonight. So we should restrict our questions, our commentary to questions only. We will have an opportunity with one more public meeting, as I understand it, and further when the recommendation comes forward to speak to the comment side of that. So who would like to go first? Yes, Councillor Kiley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Through you, I can kick it off. I'm wondering if I could ask a high-level question to staff about the relationship between the OP, the official plan, and the new zoning bylaw. I know this was covered in Ms. Flaherty's first slide, but for the benefit of the public and maybe even a reminder for council or committee here tonight, in changing any of these bylaws or the proposed changes, are we kind of hamstringing ourselves for potential changes to the OP in the future when we do an OP review? Or is it solely the other direction, that the OP would only influence zoning bylaws?
Yes, Ms. Flaherty.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councillor Kiley. So when we pass a new zoning bylaw, it's required to conform with the current official plan and not vice versa. So anything that we do in the new zoning bylaw needs to look at the existing official plan policies, all of the policies, and conform with all of the policies. So future amendments to the official plan, it doesn't matter what the new zoning bylaw says. When we're proposing amendments to the official plan, we would then also propose amendments to the new zoning bylaw to ensure that any of those amendments that we're proposing to the OP in the future would also be reflected in the new zoning bylaw.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. My next question is about the urban growth boundary. I confess to not having read every word of the 508 pages. And hope to over the next few months as we prepare to vote on this. But I didn't see in my kind of cursory look any mention specifically of that phrase urban growth boundary. And I'm wondering if staff could talk to us about the ways in which zoning bylaws impact that. Specifically, I want to know if there are any changes made to land designation that would effectively alter our urban growth boundary at this point.
Yes, Ms. Agarwal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Councillor Kiley, for that question. So our urban growth boundary is not being changed through this bylaw. The urban growth boundary has already been established by our official plan, and the new zoning bylaw will just carry that forward. So the new zoning bylaw does include the urban growth boundary on one of the schedules, but there are no changes being proposed. Any changes to the urban growth boundary, like for example, expansion of an urban growth boundary would only happen through an official plan update.
Thank you. And supplemental to that, Mr. Chair, through you is, are there any changes to what's permitted in rural areas that could essentially do what a change in the official plan for urban growth boundary could do?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So in the new zoning bylaw, there's a schedule that actually carries forward the exact urban growth boundary that's shown in the official plan. So it mimics that same information. All of the zones within that urban growth boundary are within what we call the urban zones, and all of the zones outside of that are what we call the rural zones. There are actually existing zones in the zoning bylaws that would apply to both urban and rural areas. So for example, I believe zoning bylaw 3274 right now has zones that cover both the urban and rural areas. So in creating the second draft of the new zoning bylaw, all of the rural zones apply to the rural lands and all of the urban zones apply to the urban lands. And there's no cross contamination across that urban growth boundary.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to hear that. That actually, I think, is something we should applaud along with all the other hard work that went into making this. My final question, Mr. Chair, is if staff could comment on what happens in the new zoning bylaw for corner lots. I know that I've talked with staff about some of my residents who have concerns with what's permitted on their property based on confusion on what is a front yard versus a side yard or an exterior lot line. Perhaps staff could comment on how this new bylaw would or would not address those concerns.
Yes, Ms. Flaherty.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you. In the new zoning bylaw, there are definitions for all of the lot lines. So there on corner lots, there would be 2 lot lines that are adjacent to a street. So they would either be considered a front lot line or an exterior lot line. I believe a lot of the issues that have arisen when we're looking at corner lots under the existing zoning bylaws are that in a lot of areas, they just refer to a front lot line, assuming that they're all those interior lots that don't have 2 street frontages. So for example, I think some of the driveway provisions are specifically speaking to a front lot line, but it doesn't acknowledge the potential to allow for an exterior lot line to also have a driveway accessing it. So in the new zoning bylaw, I think we've addressed all of the issues that we have in the existing bylaws, where anywhere that there's a potential for a corner lot to have something accessing from either the front lot line or the exterior lot line, that potential is covered within the provisions. So the driveway provisions, for example, don't speak specifically just to the front lot line. It speaks to that front lot line or exterior lot line.
Excellent, thank you. I know you'll have some residents in my district who are very happy to hear that, so I appreciate it.
Thank you. Who else among the committee would like to ask a question? See, Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the public and the presenters. Well done. I have a couple of questions, sort of starting at the end rather than the beginning. It has to do with it indicates in here that regarding the second draft, the detailed evaluation is to follow on proposed new zoning bylaw against the applicable policies of the PPS and the OP in a future comprehensive report. Am I correct in thinking we have to receive that before we vote on the bylaw? And more importantly, will we receive that report before we get the comprehensive report? My reasoning is that in order to really understand the policies, we need the evaluation. And if things come that are in the comprehensive report, often it's a done deal. So how are we proceeding with this?
Thank you. Ms. Flaherty.
Through you, Mr. Chair. The intent is to include the detailed explanation of the ways that the new zoning bylaw conforms with the official plan in the comprehensive report. So when we say a detailed evaluation, it's explicitly running through all of the major policy areas that need to be complied with. And that's usually done by planning staff when we're bringing a comprehensive report forward to planning committee for your consideration. So just like we would on a site-specific rezoning application, where we have that detailed evaluation and analysis of the proposal against the official plan policies. The intent here would be similar, where we would outline all of the applicable official plan policies and all of the ways that the new zoning bylaw conforms with those policies.
Right. So the approach I'm taking is we should receive that before and be able to evaluate it. So another question is, talks about here about group homes and special needs facilities. It only allows special needs facilities in institutional commercial situations. What kind of, can you give me an example of what you have in mind?
Yes, Ms. Flaherty.
Group homes.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm just pulling up the definition of special needs facility. So through the official plan update, a number of the special residential use provisions were actually removed. So before we had a lot of distinctions about different types of housing situations that were quote unquote special residential uses previously. And the only remaining facilities are the group homes and the special needs facilities. So within the context of the official plan designation, the intended types of uses that would be covered by a special needs facility might be some type of nursing home or facility where there are a significant number of supports that might shift the focus from a traditional residential use into more of an institutional type of use, where you have people who work in the facility and are providing for extra support services beyond those that are just in a standard residential use. So the definition in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw is intended to align with the definition of that's contained within the OP, which I believe Security, Ms. Agarwal, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that definition was actually specifically added to the OP by the province through the official plan update. So Security, you might weigh in on that.
Yes, so through you, Mr. Chair, yes, there was a modification made by the ministry to the official plan as it relates to the definition for special needs facilities. And if you'd like, I can actually just read it out. So special needs facility is defined as any housing, including dedicated facilities in whole or in part, that is not a group home, providing a group living arrangement for people who have specific needs beyond economic needs, including but not limited to needs such as mobility requirements or support functions required for daily living. So this definition is also actually reflected within the provincial policy statement.
Thank you. Another question? You have another question?
I do. I'm just trying to get through here and find them. In the relationship to the definition of co-living units, with relation to specific use provisions in section 6, I take it that based on what Ms. Flaherty said earlier, that these co-living units will be regarded in any residential area. And following on that, well, I'll ask that and then I've got a follow-up question.
Yes, Ms. Flaherty.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So Councillor Hutchison, yes, the co-living unit definition is intended to implement that Mayor's Task Force on Housing recommendation. And the way that we've structured it in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw is to allow those co-living units in apartment buildings. So apartment buildings could either have the co-living units or dwelling units. So a co-living unit is defined as an area intended for residential accommodation where private bedrooms and or living spaces may share the use of one common kitchen and may share common washroom facilities or living spaces. So it's really intended to allow for those private spaces to also share some of those functional things that we've traditionally in the zoning bylaw only permitted in the form of a dwelling unit where a kitchen and a bathroom are dedicated specifically to the private and they aren't able to be shared.
Okay, that's fair enough. For me anyway, how does this relate to housing cooperatives, especially those of townhouse or duplex construction? Are they allowed? Are they residential uses?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So in the new zoning bylaw, it doesn't dictate who owns or the ownership structure of any type of residential unit. It doesn't speak to the type or term of a residential lease, whether it's a short-term or long-term lease, or how the ownership is on an individual parcel of land, whether it's condominium or freehold townhouses or co-op units. So it's really focused on the function and form of that space itself rather than the ownership. So depending on the nature of the cooperative, I think that they come in many different sizes, shapes, that it would just have to conform with the requirements as though it were any other use.
Right, so that would be one of the major changes in this zoning new zoning bylaw. Because later on, you accented, you emphasized that all residential uses would be allowed in all areas, which this is one case, and previous one was another case. And so people should expect to see all different types of residential uses eventually as time passes in their areas. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So certainly the new zoning bylaw has been amended to ensure that we're focused on the fundamental land use and that it isn't getting into the tenure or the terms of any type of residential lease or the situation that may have caused someone to reside in a building or the relationship of the people who live in a unit together. So obviously the word family is within our existing zoning bylaws, and it's really focused on the people who are in there rather than the form and function of the building and the actual land use. So in the new zoning bylaw, all of the language that would be focused on the type or term of rental tenure and the people who live there, that it's been stripped from the new zoning bylaw to ensure that we're focused on that fundamental residential land use and providing equitable housing opportunities for all residents in the city.
Okay, thank you for that. It's as it said, thank you. I just want to say, Mr. Chair, it's difficult to find a question to ask because I am very interested in the housing density issue and the question of setbacks and lot frontages, because if it is as described by 2 or 3 of the public and industry people, that we would be going in the wrong direction. So I don't know if staff want take another pass at that right now or bring it up later.
Or you could share that with the planners before our next public meeting comes forward. So.
Okay, but I would say, as indicated, this is a fundamental issue. with this zoning bylaw.
Great, thank you. Who else has a question or a comment? I'm sorry, questions only. Thank you. Would you care to take the chair, Councillor Kiley?
I will, and I'll recognize you.
Great. I just have a couple of questions. One of the people asking questions, a member of the public, brought up the whole question as it related to the Williamsville Princess Street corridor. And I'm looking for reassurance that the density by design, which is what came out of the interim control bylaw, and the current newest zoning along that corridor will be incorporated into the new zoning bylaw. Is that an accurate assumption? I think Ms. Flaherty has her hand up.
Please, after you.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, Councillor Neal, the work that was recently completed and adopted, I believe, in December of 2020 for the Williamsville has been included in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw. So all of those amendments are already included and adopted. I do believe that there was a decision from the Ontario Land Tribunal on the one appeal that was submitted on the Williamsville Main Street work that was done. So there is one amendment that needs to be done to ensure that the terms of that settlement make their way into the final draft of the zoning bylaw, but certainly all of the other work has been covered.
So the 4-story height limit by right and at both ends of that stretch, allowing for taller buildings in the future. Is that accurate?
I think it's just the Princess Street and Division Street intersection that allows for the taller buildings, with the 6 stories for the remainder of the corridor. So we have the I think it's the CM1 and the CM2 zones that correspond with the 6-story height limit and the 20-story height limit, where we've pre-zoned those corner lands.
And there was some suggestion by one of the members of the public about the North Kingston secondary plan. Those recent secondary plans are reflected in the new zoning bylaw, are they?
So I might pass this question over to Ms. Agarwal to address the North Kingstown project.
Thank you. Ms.
Ms.
Agarwal.
Thank you to you, Mr. Vice Chair. The North Kingstown secondary plan is not yet complete. So once the secondary planning exercise is completed, there will be further amendments to the zoning bylaw to reflect those changes. So that would be after the new zoning bylaw has already been approved.
Great, thank you. And I really appreciate that one of your starting points was recognizing council's strategic plans, the top 4 listed, and that's leadership on climate action, increase of housing affordability, and improve walkability, roads and transportation, and finally support new and existing businesses. How specifically has this been reflected in the second draft of the zoning bylaw? How can we achieve some of those through zoning, and how can we in future achieve those goals through the OP?
Ms. Flaherty, go for it.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So certainly, I think when we're talking about these high-level strategic priorities, like demonstrating leadership on climate action, it's not something that we can write in the zoning bylaw that says you must demonstrate leadership on climate action. So I think they're priorities that have informed all of the work that we've done on the second draft of the new zoning bylaw. So specifically, I can speak to the parking discussion paper, where all of these priorities had a significant impact on all of the parking standards that we've included in the second draft of the new zoning bylaw. As it relates to housing affordability, certainly including the additional residential unit provisions that are enabled through the newer provincial legislation, allowing for the creation of new residential units in certain areas of the city by upzoning certain parcels of land through the Central Kingston growth strategy work, ensuring that we're recognizing the added costs of unnecessary zoning provisions. So maybe too much parking increases the cost of housing. So in all areas where we're able to refine the zoning bylaw provisions to help to assist in housing affordability, help to assist in the creation of new housing, demonstrating leadership on climate action, we're really speaking to the transportation and the parking related components through that parking discussion paper, and looking at ways to enhance our active transportation network by requiring bike parking and enhanced bike parking facilities to be provided on private properties, and really supporting the reduction in the private vehicle ownership and where it makes sense in the city. So I think while we haven't put these strategic priorities as specific requirements in the zoning bylaw, there's certainly priorities that have informed all of the work that we've done, and they're priorities that are impacted by the recommendations of the zoning bylaw. So the comments that I've received today related to specific performance standards, potentially decreasing the density in certain residential neighborhoods, certainly something that we want to ensure that we're getting right. So they're comments that when we receive them, we look at them with the light of the strategic priorities established by council to ensure that we're reviewing those comments and addressing them appropriately.
Great. And one of the great frustrations, and I think people have heard me bring this up before, we have approved thousands and thousands of units of housing that are now decades old. How will the new zoning bylaw help to encourage people who already have approvals to actually put their shovels in the ground?
Through you, Mr. Chair. The new zoning bylaw, so I think that goes back to the conversation that we've had about site-specific exceptions. So when we pass a site-specific exception, we don't have the ability to put a sunset clause on it where if you don't build these units within a certain period of time, you lose the right to do it. So I think it's certainly something that should inform council's consideration of the discussion about those red site-specific exceptions where we have these historic legacy exceptions that predate our official plan. Do we want to find a way to continue to allow those exceptions to be built if they haven't been built? Or do we want to delete those exceptions and let the legal non-conforming use provisions protect uses that have legally been already established under those exceptions, but people who haven't taken advantage of that, if they lose their exception in the new zoning bylaw, I think that would be encouragement to take advantage of those exceptions before they're lost. And I think I'll pass it over to Ms. Agnew.
Mr. Agnew, after you.
Thank you, and through your chair. So Laura's obviously just provided a lot of additional information, but in addition to the comments related to what is possible with the new zoning bylaw, Councillor Neal, I think one of the other pieces that council has asked us to look at within their term, so we will be doing that over the next year, is the consideration of a servicing allocation bylaw. And a servicing allocation bylaw is a tool that municipalities are able to use to award servicing associated with a development approval and put a specified period of time on it. And if the time expires before the development approval proceeds to building permit and construction, municipality does have the ability to essentially claw back that servicing allocation and bring it back into the pool and then redistribute it. So that is a type of tool that we are researching right now. We're looking at other municipalities and certainly having conversations with our partners at Utilities Kingston as we look to the future from a land utilization perspective and from a climate change perspective. We need to make most efficient use of the infrastructure and the land available to us within the urban boundary, and how we're able to do that most effectively without continuing to hold endless amounts of capacity, and then that requiring further upgrades, infrastructure expansion, all of those pieces which are spoken to ultimately in the provincial policy statement, certainly our official plan, but more direct to your particular policy level, what you've established in terms of your strategic priorities as this term of council.
Thank you. Anything that can nudge some of those decade-old approvals would be very helpful. Thank you very much.
You can have the chair back.
Thank you. Any further questions from the committee? Seeing none, I want to thank everybody, both the public and particularly staff. This was a really, really good piece and of work, and I look forward to the comprehensive report coming forward. So I now declare the public meeting complete, and we'll move into our regular planning committee special meeting. We have nothing on the agenda except our usual things. So I'll call the meeting to order. Approval of the agenda. Thank you, Councillor Hutchison, Councillor Kiley. Confirmation of minutes, we have none. Disclosure of pecuniary interest. I'm sorry. Yes.
Sorry,
This should have
Mr. Chair.
included the addendum.
The addendum and also the actual vote, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. So meeting to order, approval of the agenda, including the addendum. We had a mover and a seconder, and I believe I called the question, but we all threw our hands up quickly. So all those in favor? Carried. Thank you. Confirmation of minutes, we have none. Disclosure of pecuniary interest. Seeing none. Delegations, we have none. Briefings, we have none. Business, we have none. Motions, notices of motion, we have none. Other business, seeing none. Correspondence, we received in the addendum. Date of our next meeting, Thursday, October 21st at 6 p.m. Motion to adjourn, our favorite motion. Moved by Councillor Hill, seconded by Councillor Hutchison. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you very much. And we're